The price of oil just crossed $112 a barrel. It was $76 in January. That is a 51% increase in 5 weeks. The biggest monthly surge since the 2008 financial crisis. Gas just hit $4.09 a gallon nationally. In California, it is 5.89. Diesel is 5.43. And climbing, and I need you to understand something. This is not the spike. This is the warm-up. Right now, as you are watching this, 2,000 ships are stranded on either side of the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping traffic through the most important oil choke point on Earth has collapsed 90 to 95%. 20% of the world's oil supply is trapped. 1/3 of all globally traded fertilizer cannot get through. And planting season in America started 3 weeks ago. The nitrogen that was supposed to be in the ground feeding your corn and your wheat and your soybeans is sitting on a tanker that is not moving. That is not a supply disruption. That is a supply amputation. And the harvest that comes from it will be smaller. And the food that comes from that harvest will be more expensive. And the families that cannot afford it are already out of money. Here is what nobody is telling you. Americans are carrying $1.3 trillion in credit card debt right now, the highest ever recorded. At 22% interest, 47% of Americans cannot cover a single $1,000 emergency. The personal savings rate is 4.5%, almost half the historical average. Food prices are already 24% above pre-pandemic levels, and they are about to take another massive leg up that nobody is pricing in. Social Security is projected to go insolvent in 2032. That is 6 years away. The national debt just crossed $39 trillion. Every credit rating agency on Earth has downgraded the United States. And the Federal Reserve, the one institution that is supposed to have the tools to fix this, is trapped. It cannot cut rates because oil is pushing inflation to 4.2%. It cannot raise rates because the consumer is already drowning. And it cannot do nothing because the private credit industry, which is a $3 trillion shadow banking system with a 9% default rate, is quietly imploding behind the scenes. I want to start this video by showing you something that should genuinely terrify you if you understand what it means. And if you don't understand it yet, you will by the time I'm done talking. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow waterway off the coast of Iran that carries roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply every single day, is effectively closed, shut down. Nothing is getting through. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said publicly, and I'm going to read you this quote because I think you need to hear it in their words. They said not a single liter of oil will pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies will be considered a legitimate target. They have attacked civilian ships. They have hit energy infrastructure across the Gulf. They struck the UAE's Fujairah port. Countries in Asia that rely on oil from the Middle East are already in crisis. Pakistan told its cricket fans to watch games from home to save fuel. Hundreds of gas stations in Australia have run dry. Thailand is experiencing shortages. Airlines in Vietnam and New Zealand have canceled flights. The Philippines started a temporary 4-day workweek. China is hoarding oil and curbing exports. South Korea just announced a 5-month restriction on NAFTA exports. Asian oil demand has already dropped by nearly 2 million barrels a day just this month because the fuel literally isn't there. And last night, the Prime Minister of Australia got on national television and addressed his country like an actual leader. He said, "I know you're seeing this at the servo and at the supermarket." He said the economic shocks caused by this war will be with us for months. He cut fuel taxes in half immediately. He eliminated heavy vehicle road charges for truckers. He asked people to take public transport if they could to save diesel for farmers, nurses, and essential workers. That is what a government does when its people are suffering. Contrast that with our president, who got on True Social and told Europe to buy American oil because they should have thought about their energy needs before he decided to firebomb the Middle East. That's not diplomacy, guys. That's a protection racket. Crude oil spiked 51% in March alone, the second biggest one-month increase since futures trading launched in 1983. It went from roughly $65 a barrel before the war started to over $100 right now. CNN just reported that Bank of America is modeling a scenario where oil reaches $200 a barrel and warned it could push the U.S. economy into a recession within months. Bob McNally, the president of Rapidan Energy Group, told CNN he thinks high dollar 100s or even over $200 is reasonable. The head of Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy said there is no policy option to prevent oil prices from marching toward $200 if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. Macquarie put 40% odds on $200 oil if the war drags into June. Bloomberg talked to over 3 dozen oil traders, executives, and shippers last week, and the message was unanimous. The world still has not grasped the severity of what is happening. And the reason prices haven't completely exploded yet is because of temporary buffers. Oil that was already in transit. The largest emergency reserve release in history, 400 million barrels coordinated across IEA member nations. Temporary sanctions relief on Russian and Iranian oil. But every single one of those buffers is running out. A geopolitical strategist at BCA Research laid it out in a note this week. Right now, the world has lost 4.5 to 5 million barrels per day. By mid-April, that number doubles. He called it an oil cliff, and once we go over that cliff, there is nothing left to catch us. Everything in America moves on diesel. Everything. Now I need you to understand something about how this country actually works, because most people don't think about this until it's too late, and by then the damage is already done. Everything in America moves on diesel fuel. And I don't mean that as some vague generality. I mean literally everything you touch, eat, wear, and use got to you on a truck that burns diesel. The trucking industry moves over 70% of all freight in the United States. Every head of lettuce, every gallon of milk, every piece of lumber, every Amazon package, every prescription from the pharmacy, it all got there on a truck. And fuel accounts for 30 to 40% of the total operating cost for trucking companies. So when diesel prices spike, every single thing in the supply chain gets more expensive. Not eventually, immediately. And diesel has already been hit harder than gasoline. Diesel prices have climbed 44% in the last month. In some places, it's way worse. NPR just interviewed a trucker in Connecticut who said he saw a truck stop charging $8.31 a gallon for diesel. $8.31. And this is a guy named Monty Widerhold, who's been trucking for almost 50 years. He owns a small fleet in Ohio, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said trucking is a penny business. My dad taught me that. Take care of the pennies, son, and the dollars will take care of themselves. And then he said if fuel goes to that level and stays there for an extended period of time, our economy, our country is going to be in a real hurt. And here's what people don't understand. Small business truckers make up 96% of all fleets in America. 96%. These aren't massive corporate operations with billions in reserves. These are families with 3 trucks, 5 trucks, 10 trucks who are watching their margins evaporate overnight. And when their costs go up, they have no choice but to raise their rates. And when their rates go up, every business they deliver to raises their prices. And when those businesses raise their prices, you pay more at the register. That's how $5 diesel becomes $8 eggs. That's how $6 diesel becomes $7 bread. That's how $8 diesel becomes the grocery bill that makes you pull out your phone and check your bank account before you check out. And it doesn't stop at the grocery store. During the 1973 oil crisis, which is the closest historical parallel to what we're experiencing right now, vehicle sales dropped 23%. Fertilizer prices tripled, which pushed grocery inflation to 20%. Airlines faced fuel supply cuts of up to 50%, which caused mass layoffs at aircraft manufacturers. And the Kleinman Center at the University of Pennsylvania just published an analysis pointing out that the Strait of Hormuz carries up to 30% of global nitrogen fertilizer exports. Fertilizer is the thing that makes food grow. If fertilizer gets disrupted or becomes unaffordable, you don't just have expensive food, you have less food. And that doesn't hit in April, that hits in the fall when the harvest comes in short. The OECD is already projecting this will push U.S. inflation back above 4% this year. But here's the thing. Nobody on the news is saying that 4% number assumes the strait reopens soon and oil stabilizes below $100. If it doesn't, if oil stays above $100 or God forbid it goes to $150 or $200, we are not looking at 4% inflation. We are looking at something that rewrites the cost of living in this country overnight. And the people who are already living paycheck to paycheck, the 59% who can't cover a $1,000 emergency, the 80 million working side hustles, the families already drowning in $18.8 trillion of household debt, those are the people who get crushed first. Not Wall Street, not the politicians, not the oil executives who are about to post record profits. You, the person watching this video right now, that's who pays the price for $200 oil. And nobody in Washington is preparing you for it. The food chain is already breaking. Everyone is watching the gas pump. That is the number everyone talks about. But let me tell you something that is going to affect your life even more than what you pay to fill your tank, and almost nobody is covering it. The food supply chain in the United States runs on 2 things, diesel and fertilizer, and both of them just got hit at the same time. More than one-third of all globally traded fertilizer passes through the Strait of Hormuz. One-third, and right now that strait is closed. Since the strikes began at the end of February, the price of urea, which is the nitrogen-based fertilizer that American farmers depend on to grow corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice, has surged roughly 50%. In Egypt, which is a bellwether for global nitrogen pricing, granular urea jumped from around $450 per metric ton to over $700. 54 agricultural groups in the United States wrote a letter to President Trump in March calling for emergency relief because farmers are watching their input costs explode right at the start of planting season. And that timing is the part nobody is explaining clearly enough. Fertilizer is not something you can just apply whenever you feel like it. There is a window. In the Northern Hemisphere, peak nitrogen application happens between March and May. If you miss that window, the crop does not get a second chance. Shipments disrupted in early March need 30 to 45 days to reach U.S. ports, which means the supply that was supposed to arrive during the most critical weeks of the year is not coming. And when nitrogen application drops, two things happen. Some farmers switch from corn to less nitrogen-intensive crops like soybeans, and the corn that does get planted receives less fertilizer and produces lower yields. Both of those outcomes reduce the grain supply, hitting the market in the third and fourth quarter of this year. Now here is why that matters to you, even if you have never set foot on a farm. Corn is the foundational feedstock for beef, dairy, and poultry in the United States. Higher corn prices cascade directly into meat, milk, and egg prices. And we are not talking about a hypothetical scenario. Fund managers are already telling CNBC they are more concerned about this fertilizer crisis than they were about the Russia-Ukraine disruption in 2022, because this one could directly reduce agricultural yields across multiple major crops at the same time. And then you stack diesel on top of it. Red diesel, the fuel that powers farm machinery, has surged 80% since the conflict began. The agriculture sector in the United States uses about 2% of all national energy just for farm production. Every tractor, every combine, every irrigation pump, every grain dryer, and then everything that comes off the farm has to move on a truck, and trucks run on diesel, and diesel is above $5 a gallon. So the cost of growing the food goes up, the cost of processing the food goes up, the cost of shipping the food goes up, and the cost of keeping it cold in the store goes up. Wolf Research estimates that this disruption alone could raise food-at-home inflation by roughly 2 percentage points, on top of the 0.40 percentage point increase from energy. Food prices in America have already climbed nearly 24% above pre-pandemic levels, and global food prices are projected to rise another 12 to 18% by the end of 2026, even if the Hormuz crisis ended tomorrow. The Atlantic Council has mapped 3 waves of economic pain from this crisis. The first wave was oil. That is already here. The second wave is fertilizer during planting season. That is hitting right now. The third wave is the food price surge that arrives in the fall when the reduced harvests reach the market. And the bottom quintile of American households already spends nearly 1/3 of their income on food. There are no strategic fertilizer reserves anywhere in the G7. None. Nobody stockpiled for this. And the World Food Program estimates the crisis could push 45 million additional people globally into acute hunger by mid-26. The American consumer has nothing left. I need you to understand who is about to absorb all of this. Because the person about to get hit with $8 gas and a 30% food price increase is not sitting on a pile of savings waiting for a storm. That person is already drowning. Total credit card debt in the United States just crossed $1.3 trillion. That is the highest level ever recorded by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since they started tracking it in 1990. Credit card balances have surged 66% since the first quarter of 2021. That is not a gradual increase. That is a vertical line on a chart, and 47% of all credit card holders are carrying a balance from month to month. Not paying it off, carrying it, at an average interest rate above 22%. Let me say that number again. 22%. That means nearly half of all cardholders in this country are paying a fifth of their balance every year just in interest, before they even touch the principal. And the reason they are carrying that debt is not because they went on vacation or bought something they did not need. 33% of debtors say their credit card debt comes from day-to-day expenses. Groceries, childcare, utilities. The basics. That number is up from 28% in 2024 and 26% in 2023. It is accelerating. And what about savings? The personal savings rate in the United States is sitting at 4.5%. That is almost half the long-run historical average of 8.4%. The bottom half of Americans save nothing. or they go negative. The aggregate number you see reported is entirely propped up by high earners who save substantial shares of their income. Strip them out, and the average household has no buffer at all. Bankrate found that only 47% of Americans have enough liquid savings to cover a single $1,000 emergency expense. Not a job loss, not a medical crisis. A single $1,000 problem. And 29% of Americans have more credit card debt than emergency savings, more debt than savings. Think about that. 22% of people carrying a credit card balance say they do not think they will ever pay it off, ever. Not in a year, not in 5 years. They have accepted it as a permanent condition. 61% of people with credit card debt have been in debt for at least a year, and that number jumped from 53% just 12 months earlier. This is the person you are asking to absorb $200 oil. This is the household that is about to watch their grocery bill jump another 20% on top of the 24% increase they have already eaten since 2020. This is the family that is going to watch diesel push the price of everything, not just gas but everything that arrives at a store on a truck, higher at the exact moment they have no savings, no margin, and a credit card that charges them 22 cents on the dollar for the privilege of staying afloat. A quarter of U.S. households are already living paycheck to paycheck. Consumer spending accounts for roughly 70% of American GDP. That is the engine. And the engine is not slowing down because people want to spend less. It is slowing down because they physically cannot spend any more. David Schneider, a certified financial planner, described it as a consumer breaking point, where households exhausted by high inflation and record debt finally hit a financial wall. And that wall is about to get hit by a wrecking ball made of oil, fertilizer, and food prices that nobody in Washington is preparing them for. The Fed is trapped and nobody will say it. So here is the question nobody on cable news, nobody in Congress, and nobody at the Federal Reserve wants to answer honestly. What do you do when the two biggest crises in the economy require opposite solutions? Because that is exactly where we are right now. On one side, you have the private credit industry cracking, consumer debt at record highs, credit card delinquencies rising, housing frozen, and an entire generation of Americans who cannot borrow their way out of another month. The textbook answer to that problem is to cut interest rates. Lower the cost of borrowing, give people relief, stimulate the economy. That is what the Fed did in 2008. That is what they did in 2020. It is the only tool they really have. But on the other side, you have oil above $100 a barrel, diesel surging, fertilizer prices up 50%, food inflation about to take another massive leg up, and an OECD forecast projecting U.S. inflation will rise to 4.2% in 2026. If you cut rates into that, you pour gasoline on the inflation fire. You make every single price in the economy go up even faster. So the Fed cannot cut, and 97% of interest rate traders agree. As of late March, the CME FedWatch tool shows that almost nobody on Wall Street expects a rate cut at the April meeting, or likely any meeting in 2026. The Federal Reserve held rates steady at its March meeting at 3.50 to 3.75%, and actually raised its inflation forecast for 2026 to 2.7%. But here is what they did not say publicly, and what everyone in the bond market already knows. The Fed is not holding because it wants to, it is holding because it has no choice. If it cuts, inflation runs hotter, and mortgage rates do not come down anyway because Treasury yields spike on inflation fears. If it holds, the consumer keeps getting crushed under 22% credit card rates and 6.5% mortgages, while private credit defaults keep climbing. If it raises, which nobody even wants to consider, it crashes the housing market, triggers a wave of corporate bankruptcies, and probably causes the private credit time bomb we talked about in Section 10 to detonate. Every door leads to a worse room. And the people who are supposed to be steering this economy know it. The OECD warned explicitly that if energy disruptions persist, outcomes could be significantly worse than current projections. But they said it in the footnotes, not in the headline, because nobody wants to say it out loud. And here is what makes this different from 2008 or 2020. In those crises, the Fed had room. In 2008, rates were at 5.25%. They could cut aggressively. In 2020, they could slash to zero and print trillions because inflation was not a threat. Today, rates have already been cut from their peak. There is less room to go lower. And the one thing that would allow the Fed to cut, which is falling inflation, is being destroyed by the oil shock in real time. Mortgage rates are sitting at 6.46% as of this week. They briefly touched below 6% in late February, when markets panicked about tariffs and rushed into bonds. But the moment the war in Iran pushed oil prices higher, mortgage rates reversed and climbed to their highest levels of the year. Oil is not just an energy story, it is an inflation story. And inflation is not just a price story, it is a Federal Reserve story. And the Federal Reserve story is not just about interest rates. It is about whether or not the single institution that is supposed to protect the economy from collapse has the ability to do anything at all. And right now, the honest answer is no. They are trapped. The private credit market needs lower rates to survive. The consumer needs lower rates to breathe. The housing market needs lower rates to function. And oil will not let any of it happen. That is the trap. And when the food price wave hits in the fall, it gets worse, not better. Worse. Businesses are going under, and nobody is counting. Here is something you will not see on any cable news chyron. Total bankruptcy filings in the United States rose 11% in 2025. Business filings specifically rose 7.1%. Chapter 11 bankruptcies hit a decade-long high, and that was before the oil shock, before fertilizer prices doubled, before diesel crossed $5. PwC is projecting another increase in 2026 and called it a direct consequence of higher input costs meeting slowing consumer demand. Coface, one of the largest credit insurers in the world, said the U.S. has entered insolvency overshoot territory and warned that firms have been absorbing the cost of tariffs out of their own margins, which means the pain has been building beneath the surface for months and is only now starting to show up in the numbers. Every major oil price spike in the last 25 years has been followed by a surge in business collapses. Every single one. And this one is not a modest bump. Oil went from $60 a barrel in January to over $100 in a matter of weeks. The companies going down are not abstractions. Saks Global filed for bankruptcy in January. A Popeyes franchisee operating over 130 locations went under the same month. An Applebee's franchisee running 53 restaurants filed in March. Francesca's is liquidating. Torrid is closing 30% of its stores. Foot Locker reported net losses and declining sales. These are the places where normal Americans work and shop, and behind every one of those filings are hundreds or thousands of employees who just lost their income at the exact moment the cost of everything in their life is going up. Moody's has a negative outlook on the entire retail industry for 2026. Their analyst called consumer spending resilience remarkable but warned that shoppers cannot handle much more in terms of price increases, and what is about to hit them is not a price increase. It is a price earthquake driven by oil, diesel, fertilizer, and food, all moving in the same direction at the same time. The businesses that survived the pandemic, survived inflation, and survived tariffs are now staring down an energy shock with no margin left to absorb it. The petrodollar is being challenged in real time. Everything I have told you so far is about what $200 oil does to prices, but there is a layer underneath all of it that almost nobody is talking about, and it is arguably the most dangerous one. The petrodollar system has been the foundation of American economic power for 50 years. Since 1974, when Kissinger cut a secret deal with Saudi Arabia, virtually all oil on Earth has been priced and sold in US dollars. That means every country that imports oil needs dollars. That creates permanent global demand for the dollar, which is what allows the United States to borrow at low interest rates, run massive deficits, and maintain the reserve currency status that underpins the entire economy. Iran is now directly attacking that system. After closing the Strait of Hormuz, Tehran announced that tankers could pass through if they agreed to sell their oil in Chinese yuan instead of dollars. CNN confirmed it. Deutsche Bank published a report warning that this conflict could be remembered as the catalyst for petrodollar erosion and the beginning of the petro-yuan. India is already settling Russian crude purchases in yuan and UAE dirhams, bypassing the dollar entirely. Bloomberg reported 60 million barrels per month moving through alternative settlement rails. Saudi Arabia quietly let its exclusive dollar pricing commitment lapse in June 2024 and has built the technical infrastructure for yuan settlement through a $7 billion currency swap with China. The UI settlement through a $7 billion currency swap with China's national debt crossed $39 trillion on March 18th, and every credit rating agency has now downgraded the United States. The dollar still accounts for 58% of global reserves. It is not collapsing overnight, but the system is no longer unquestioned. Countries are not abandoning the dollar. They are hedging against the possibility that access to it might be taken away, because the United States has used sanctions to freeze Russian reserves, cut Iran off from SWIFT, and threaten 100% tariffs on BRICS nations. When you weaponize a currency, eventually the rest of the world builds alternatives. And right now, in the middle of a war over the most important oil choke point on Earth, those alternatives are being tested in real time for the first time in 50 years. The housing market is frozen and oil made it worse. The one thing that could have given the American middle class a lifeline in all of this was the housing market. If mortgage rates had come down the way everyone expected at the start of the year, millions of locked-in homeowners could have sold, traded up, traded down, relocated for work, or freed up equity to survive the storm. That was the plan. Fannie Mae forecast rates near 6%, some analysts predicted the high fives, and for one brief moment in late February, the 30-year fixed rate actually dipped below 6%. Then the war started. Oil surged, inflation expectations reversed, Treasury yields climbed, and mortgage rates shot back up to 6.46%. Their highest level of the year. 97% of traders now expect no rate cut in April. The Fed raised its own inflation forecast to 2.7%. The OECD is projecting 4.2%. The brief window of relief that homebuyers and sellers were counting on slammed shut in a matter of days. And it is not just the rate. The entire housing market is structurally paralyzed. Millions of homeowners locked in 3% mortgages during the pandemic are refusing to sell because moving means giving up that rate for something twice as high. Inventory is still 20% below pre-COVID levels. Home prices keep setting records even though nobody can afford them, because there is nothing for sale. And here is the trap within the trap. The Fed cannot lower rates because oil is pushing inflation higher. But higher rates keep the housing market frozen. And a frozen housing market means people cannot move for jobs, cannot downsize to save money, cannot access their equity, and cannot escape unaffordable regions. They are pinned in place. The one asset that the American middle class has always relied on as a safety net, their home, has become a cage, and $200 oil is the thing that locked the door. Your children are going to pay for this, and they don't even know it yet. Everything I have laid out in this video, the private credit bomb, the oil cliff, the food chain breaking, the consumer with nothing left, the Fed trapped, businesses going under, the petrodollar cracking, the housing market frozen, all of it lands on one group of people harder than anyone else. And it is the group that had no say in any of it. 14 million children in the United States live in food-insecure households right now, before the oil shock, before the food price wave hits this fall. And Congress just passed the largest cut to SNAP in the history of the program. $187 billion slashed from the one thing standing between millions of families and hunger. They cut it on July 4th, Independence Day. The child poverty rate is 13.4%. It was 5.2% in 2021 when the expanded child tax credit was in place. They let that expire too. And meanwhile, Social Security, the program that every working American pays into with every single paycheck, is now projected to be insolvent by the fourth quarter of 2032. Not 2040. Not some distant hypothetical. 6 years from right now. When that happens, benefits get cut 24% across the board automatically. For the average retiree, that is roughly $18,000 a year in lost income. Gone. And here is the part that should make you furious. The baby boomer generation holds over $85 trillion in assets, more than 50% of all wealth in the United States, and they make up less than 20% of the population. Millennials and Gen Z are spending 40 to 50% of their income on rent. They cannot build equity. They cannot start businesses. They are carrying record student debt and record credit card debt at the same time. And they are the ones being asked to fund through their payroll taxes the retirements of the wealthiest generation in human history. The Congressional Budget Office's 2026 outlook said it plainly. The current economic model is unsustainable. The national debt crossed $39 trillion last month. The U.S. has been downgraded by every major credit rating agency. Interest on the debt is now the fastest growing line item in the federal budget. And the oil shock is making all of it worse because it is pushing inflation higher, which means the government has to borrow at higher interest rates, which means the debt grows faster, which means there is even less money for the programs that children and families depend on. Your kids are inheriting an economy with no savings, no safety net, a crumbling retirement system, a broken housing market, and a currency that the rest of the world is slowly learning to live without. And nobody in a position of power is even pretending to fix it. Nobody is coming to save you. Wall Street built a $3 trillion shadow banking system with no regulation, and it is cracking. Oil went from $60 to over $100 in weeks, and the cliff is still ahead of us. The food supply chain is breaking because fertilizer cannot get through the strait, and planting season is already here. The American consumer has $1.3 trillion in credit card debt, a savings rate half the historical average, and 47% of them cannot cover a single $1,000 emergency. The Federal Reserve is trapped between an inflation crisis and a credit crisis, and every move it makes helps one problem and worsens the other. Businesses are filing for bankruptcy at a decade-high rate, and oil is about to accelerate it. The petrodollar, the foundation of American economic power for 50 years, is being challenged in real time by a country that controls the most important choke point on Earth. The housing market is frozen because the one thing that could free it, lower rates, is impossible, as long as oil keeps pushing inflation higher. Your children are inheriting a bankrupt retirement system, a gutted safety net, and $39 trillion in debt. And every single one of these problems is connected. Oil feeds inflation. Inflation traps the Fed. A trapped Fed crushes consumers. Crushed consumers kill businesses. Dead businesses destroy jobs. Lost jobs deepen poverty. Deeper poverty breaks families. And broken families raise a generation that never had a chance. That is what $200 oil does to America. It does not just raise the price of gas, it pulls the thread that unravels everything. And nobody on television is laying it out for you like this, because the people on television are paid to keep you calm. They are paid to tell you the economy is resilient. They are paid to say the consumer is strong. They are paid to call it a soft landing. It is not a soft landing. It is a trap with no exit, and you are already inside it. So what do? You do what Americans have always done when the institutions fail them. You stop waiting for permission. You stop waiting for a rate cut that is not coming. You stop waiting for a politician who is not listening. You get your own house in order. You reduce your exposure. You build a margin. You pay attention. Because the people who will survive what is coming are not the ones with the most money. They are the ones who saw it first, and now you have seen it. If this video made you think, share it with somebody you care about. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, because this is not the end of the story. This is the beginning.